Alright, let's go. Number 10. Scorpion bombs. In the spring of 198 AD, outside the walls of Hatra, a wealthy city-state in what is now northern Iraq, the Roman army of the Emperor Septimius Severus failed. Twice, the city's defenders had something the Romans could not counter, something the historian Dio Cassius would later describe as warfare conducted outside the law. Modern archaeologists would eventually identify what it was: ceramic vessels, sealed, designed to shatter on impact, filled with live scorpions. Toxic warfare. Before the phrase existed, the city of Hatra occupied the Syrian desert between the Tigris and the Euphrates, prime habitat for Androctonus crassicauda, the fat-tail scorpion, one of the most venomous species alive today. Its venom contains chlorotoxin and psyllotoxin. A single sting is sufficient to kill a child. In quantity, the compound triggers respiratory depression in healthy adults. The terracotta cylinders recovered from Hatra's defensive positions during 1930s and 1950s excavations measured approximately 10 to 15 centimeters across, the right volume to contain 20 to 30 live specimens. Adrienne Mayer's 2009 analysis in the Journal of Military History established the forensic and textual case. The ceramic profile matched no known storage vessel type in the Hatran archaeological record. The shapes were engineered for a single use: a hard throw, a clean shatter, and then the contents hit the ground among men in tight military formation. For decades, historians attributed the Roman failure at Hatra primarily to desert heat and the city's fortification architecture. The classical sources were treated as accounts of a city that simply held. But here's where the standard reading misses what Dio Cassius actually recorded. Mayer cross-referenced his text with the physical excavation data and found that the sealed vessels appeared in concentration precisely along the most frequently attacked wall sections. Their ceramic profile showed no secondary use history, no residue of food, oil, or wine, only intact biological material in the sealed fragments, partial arachnid exoskeleton. The pots were not storage containers that happened to be nearby. They were purpose-made. The logistics implied by that conclusion are significant. Someone in Hatra maintained a live scorpion supply, managed the containment of venomous animals in quantity, and developed a deployment protocol for releasing them at point of impact against a dense. The desert around Hatra provided a near inexhaustible supply source. The fat-tail scorpion is aggressive, difficult to handle, and survives poorly in captivity unless managed with care. The Hatran defenders had at minimum a working knowledge of arachnid husbandry that they were willing to convert into military supply chain logistics. That is not improvisation. That is preparation. The Roman military had no response protocol for this. There is no legionary formation drill that addresses 400 scorpions released at ground level among men in sandals and short armor. There is no shield configuration that helps. The Romans retreated both times. Dio Cassius called what the Hatrans used warfare outside the law. The condemnation sits in a subordinate clause, easily missed, never elaborated, but it is there. The first Roman legal acknowledgement that some weapons fall outside the categories that ius gentium, the law of nations, is designed to address. Not because the Hatrans were cruel, because the weapon required no courage, no proximity, no skill transferable to a fair fight. The scorpion bomb did not confront a soldier, it released chaos into a crowd. Rome knew the difference. So did the Hatrans. And Dio Cassius, writing it down 2 generations later, understood that the distinction mattered enough to note. The scorpion bomb is not a footnote curiosity. It is the proof that the logic behind every chemical weapon ever built, use what the body cannot defend against, was available to any commander willing to cross the line. The question was never capability. The question was always whether anyone would. All right. Number 9. The hellebore wells. Around 595 BC, the Amphictyonic League, a coalition of Greek city-states organized around the sanctuary at Delphi, declared war on the city of Cirrha. Cirrha had been raiding pilgrims traveling to consult the oracle. The League appointed Solon of Athens, one of the 7 sages of Greece, the figure most identified with the foundations of Athenian law and democracy, to advise the campaign. Solon's recommendation is recorded in fragments and in later historical accounts. He diverted the Pleistos River upstream from the city and steeped massive quantities of white hellebore root into the channel before routing it back into Cirrha's water supply. The city was incapacitated within hours. The siege that might have lasted months lasted days. White hellebore veratrum album is an alpine flowering plant whose roots contain steroidal alkaloids including cyclopamine, jervine, and veratridine. At low doses, the compound causes severe nausea and vertigo. At higher concentrations, cardiovascular collapse follows. Ancient physicians used controlled doses as a purgative, one of the more brutal remedies in the pre-modern medical toolkit. In the concentration Solon introduced to a city's entire water supply, the effect was mass incapacitation. The veratridine alkaloids in veratrum album act on the same sodium channels targeted by aconitine. Onset is rapid, within 30 to 60 minutes of ingestion at sufficient dose. Josephus, describing a comparable poisoning, called it a sickness that prevented men from standing. The accounts of Cirrha vary in detail, but agree on the outcome. The defenders could not hold their weapons. The Amphictyonic League treated the victory as a military success. Solon's reputation as a strategist was enhanced by it. For most of subsequent Greek history, Cirrha was remembered as a campaign won by intelligence, but what the League did immediately afterward is where the history shifts. The Amphictyonic Council convened and passed a resolution that scholars at the University of Edinburgh, in a 2008 study on pre-modern laws of war, identified as among the earliest recorded prohibitions of a chemical weapon in human history. The resolution explicitly forbade the poisoning of water supplies in warfare between member states. The reasoning, preserved in fragmentary form, did not invoke mercy or compassion. It invoked distinction, a principle modern international law would rediscover too. A poisoned water supply kills civilians, children, livestock. It cannot discriminate between a combatant and a non-combatant. The Amphictyonic Council, meeting at Delphi around 590 BC, understood the concept of a non-discriminate weapon clearly enough to legislate against it. Consider what this means. The oldest formal chemical weapons prohibition in recorded history was written by a committee of Greek priests at an oracle site in the 6th century BC, 5 years after they themselves used the weapon. The Geneva Convention articulated the same principle in 1949. The Amphictyons beat them by 2,539 years. The mechanism of the Cirrha poisoning also had a second consequence that the council appears to have registered. It was invisible. An army attacked with spears can see spears. An army attacked with swords can see swords and respond. The soldiers of Cirrha did not know they had been poisoned until they could not stand. The water looked normal. The wells looked normal. The hellebore alkaloids had no taste or color in the concentration Solon introduced. By the time the symptoms appeared, the compound had already been absorbed. The defenders experienced incapacitation as a sudden internal failure with no external cause they could identify or respond to. The Amphictyonic Council recognized this quality specifically. A weapon that works before the enemy knows they are being attacked is not just more lethal. It is a different category of violence. They had used the weapon. They had seen what it did. They wrote the law immediately, not because they were ashamed of the victory, because they were afraid of what happened next if the method became standard practice across the Greek interstate system. A weapon that works on water supplies works on every city. The Amphictyons had just demonstrated that. They were writing a law against their own innovation in real time because they understood the consequence of leaving it unrestricted. All right. Number 8. Sulfuric siege smoke. BC. Boeotia. A Spartan allied force was attempting to breach an Athenian-held position at Delium, a walled temple complex that Athenian forces had fortified after their catastrophic open field defeat the previous day. The Boeotians could not scale the wall directly, could not breach it. What they built instead is documented by Thucydides in Book 4 of his History of the Peloponnesian War, the only surviving account, written by a historian who covered this conflict with the precision of a military analyst. Thucydides describes a machine, not a catapult, not a ram, a machine built to project. The device was a large hollow beam, a section of timber wide enough in diameter to contain the mechanism inside, fitted at one end with a bellows and at the other with a suspended iron cauldron containing a burning mixture of pitch, sulfur, and coal. The bellows forced air over the burning mass. The gas traveled the length of the beam and emerged, concentrated, directly against the wall of the Athenian position. The Athenians abandoned the wall. The Boeotians took the position. Military historians have largely treated the Delium device as an improvised siege curiosity, an extreme adaptation of available materials, not a systematic chemical weapon. The standard view frames it as a one-time engineering improvisation in a minor engagement. But the bellows is the problem. A bellows is not improvised. A bellows attached to a sealed burning chamber is a purpose-built mechanism to force gas in a controlled stream. The same component was standard in Greek and Roman bellows forges for metal smelting, a technology with a long operational history in the Aegean. By the 5th century BC, someone at Delium took a known piece of industrial equipment, loaded the adjacent chamber with toxic combustibles, and aimed the output at a fortification. A 2011 study by researchers at the University of Haifa specifically identified the Delium device as the earliest unambiguous example of a purpose-designed chemical delivery weapon in Western military history, not a desperate improvisation. Applied engineering from an existing industrial knowledge base. The Spartans had used a less sophisticated variant at Plataea 4 years earlier, in 4427 BC, burning pitch and sulfur at the base of the walls without a directional delivery mechanism. They developed the pressurized beam version in the intervening years. The knowledge passed to their Boeotian allies. And then, no non-allied state appears to have deployed the device in the century after Delium. The technology did not spread because it was deliberately contained within the Spartan military engineering tradition, and then lost as that tradition collapsed in the decades following Sparta's decline. The Boeotians who built the machine in 423 BC are not named in Thucydides. The engineers who developed the bellows adaptation for the Spartans at Plataea are not named. This is itself significant. The ritual of military glory in the classical Greek world was inseparable from naming, generals, architects of victories, inventors of decisive tactics. The silence around the gas device suggests the method was deliberately kept out of the record of honorable achievement. The machine worked. That is why they didn't talk about it. All right. Number 7, Toxicon. 7th century BC, the Eurasian steppe. The Scythians, Iron Age nomads ranging from the northern Black Sea coast to the edge of Persia, were known across the ancient world for one thing: their arrows. Not the bow, the arrows themselves. What was on the tips? The word toxic is a Scythian inheritance. The Greek word toxikon means literally of the bow, the poison applied to arrow tips. The etymological root of the English word for chemical danger is an Iron Age nomad's arrowhead preparation process. That etymology is not a footnote. It is evidence that the Scythian arrow poison was specific enough, distinct enough, and widespread enough in its use that a civilization adopted a word for it, and that word expanded across centuries of translation and bureaucratic codification to describe the entire category of chemical harm. Aristotle attempted a partial analysis in his Historia Animalium. Ovid, Strabo, and Pseudo-Apollodorus all describe the preparation in their respective texts. A 2009 paper by Adrienne Mayer and Antoinette Reek in the journal Toxicon assembled the classical descriptions and cross-referenced them with botanical and toxicological evidence. The most probable Scythian toxicon combined 3 elements: decomposed biological matter from human or animal cadavers, venom milked from Vipera birus, the common European adder, and expressed juice from Aconitum napellus, known today as monkshood or wolfsbane. Each component targets a different physiological system. Viper venom contains hemotoxic and cytotoxic compounds that begin dissolving tissue at the wound site. Aconitine floods sodium channels in cardiac muscle, producing arrhythmia progressing toward arrest. Decomposed biological matter introduces septic contamination that ensures any wound that does not kill immediately kills slowly through infection. Applied to a barbed arrow designed to resist extraction, the combination had a kill profile significantly more reliable than the arrow wound alone. The barb prevented clean removal. The toxin traveled. The infection finished what the toxin started. Rome treated this as categorically distinct from killing by blade. The Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Veneficis, passed under Sulla in 81 BC, made the preparation and use of toxic weapons a capital offense. Roman soldiers deployed as archers were explicitly forbidden by military regulation from applying toxin to their arrows in combat against human targets. Vegetius documents this prohibition in his Epitome of Military Science, not as an aspiration, as an existing rule because someone was consistently breaking it. The Scythian method spread through contact, not conquest. Trajan's campaigns against the Dacians in 101-102 AD encountered soldiers using toxicon-prepared arrows. The Dacians had absorbed Scythian military technology through generations of steppe-adjacent warfare. The Parthians used a variant documented by Plutarch following Cirrha in 53 BC. Greek physicians at Pergamon in the 2nd century AD were publishing antidotes specifically formulated for toxicon-contaminated wounds. The work of Galen includes passages on this. An antidote developed to clinical specificity implies regular caseloads. Regular caseloads imply volume. Volume implies a weapon in continuous use. The antidote literature is its own form of evidence. Galen would not publish on something his clinic was not regularly treating. The Roman military's prohibition on poisoned arrows was generating enough violations to keep a Pergamon physician busy. The word toxic comes from an arrowhead, not from a chemist, not from a treaty, from a nomad, pressing a dead snake against a barbed iron tip somewhere in the 7th century BC. Every civilization that encountered the Scythian method eventually wrote a law against it. The laws defined what the arrow was. None stopped it. But they confirmed something important. Everyone who encountered the weapon understood it was not the same kind of death as a sword. The naming was an acknowledgement that the category was real and that it required its own legal response. All right, number 6, quicklime. The weapon does not have a single dramatic origin point. It has a pattern, the same material, the same application, documented independently across cultures with no contact with each other in overlapping centuries, arriving at the same prohibition with roughly the same logic. Byzantine military manuals, Chinese siege engineering texts from the 10th century, Crusader chronicles from the 12th, all describe calcium oxide deployed as a weapon against personnel. All describe the same injuries. All arrive at the same prohibition, independently formulated within the same historical window. The convergence is not coincidence. It is what happens when an abundant mineral with a specific chemical property enters the hands of people motivated to find weapons that do not require direct physical contact. Quicklime, calcium oxide, is a standard building material, produced by burning limestone at high temperature, available anywhere stone was quarried, which by the medieval period meant everywhere stone was used to construct anything. Calcium oxide reacts with water, any water, including the moisture in human eyes, nasal passages, and lung tissue. The reaction produces calcium hydroxide and releases heat, approximately 65 kilojoules per mole. In practice, quicklime reaching an eyeball initiates chemical burns to the corneal surface. The heat compounds the damage. Blindness results from brief exposure. Inhalation of powdered quicklime causes chemical burns to the respiratory airways. On a ship deck, fine quicklime aerosolized by wind can incapacitate an entire crew simultaneously before any individual crewman identifies the source or direction of the attack. Roger of Hoveden, a 12th century English chronicler, records that defenders near Jaffa in 1192 used white powder thrown from the walls to blind advancing attackers. The 13th century Chinese military manual Hua Longjing documents quicklime bombs, ceramic spheres packed with powdered calcium oxide, deployed in city sieges specifically against personnel rather than fortifications. The Chinese documentation is operational. It includes yield estimates and deployment instructions, not merely a description of the incident. The Byzantine Siloge Tacticorum, compiled around 950 AD, describes quicklime naval deployment as a valid tactic against non-Christian vessels, while specifically noting the practice was considered outside the bounds of civilized warfare between Christian states. The Byzantine-Chinese independent convergence brackets the weapon's development. Two ends of Eurasia, the same material, the same result. The step from caustic building material to weapon against unprotected skin is not a conceptual leap. It is the step any person takes who understands what calcium oxide does when it meets moisture, and who stands behind a wall being climbed by an enemy. Frederick II issued a prohibition against quicklime on Christian combat in the 13th century. The prohibition did not cover all combat, only combat between Christians. The same weapon was acceptable against certain enemies and banned against others. That logic, not a restriction on the chemistry, but a restriction on the target, describes almost every chemical weapon prohibition in ancient and medieval history. The question was never whether the compound could be used. It was always who it could be used on. A bag of limestone powder, available at every construction site in the ancient and medieval world. The only innovation was pointing it at a face. All right, number 5. Pitch cauldrons. 70 AD, Jerusalem. the Roman siege of the Temple Mount, documented in near real time by Josephus in his Jewish War. Josephus was present. He describes the Jewish defenders deploying a specific incendiary from the temple walls as Titus's forces approached the base. Not burning oil, not fire arrows, pitch, heated, liquefied, poured from height onto men in formation below. Pitch, also called mineral bitumen or natural tar, is a semi-solid petroleum distillate. It seeps naturally across the Dead Sea Basin and the broader Levant from subsurface hydrocarbon deposits. At ambient temperature, it moves slowly. Heated, it liquefies. Its combustion temperature is approximately 400 degrees Celsius. Unlike water-based fire, burning pitch cannot be extinguished by smothering with fabric or earth in field conditions. It adheres to whatever surface it contacts and sustains combustion until the fuel is exhausted or the material is physically removed. Josephus describes men burning, not as if touched by fire, but as if consumed from within. The phrasing is consistent with deep thermal burns from a substance that clings to skin and penetrates gaps in armor. Boiling water burns and then cools. Steam disperses. Pitch ignites, adheres, and continues. The distinction matters clinically. A Roman soldier struck by boiling water in armor might survive with treatment, irrigation, poultice. A soldier with burning pitch fused to his equipment and skin could not be treated with anything available in the Roman army's medical supply in 70 AD. Military historians typically catalog pitch cauldrons within a generic category of heated materials in siege warfare, a grouping that treats all cauldron deployments as functionally equivalent to boil. But pitch is not boiling water. The chemistry is not the same. Medical papyri recovered from Roman-era Egypt, including the Oxyrhynchus medical texts, describe treatment protocols for burn wounds, and make a specific distinction between burns responsive to standard poultice treatment and oil-based burns that produce wounds of a different character and do not respond to the same intervention. That clinical distinction in an Egyptian medical text from the Roman period is the fingerprint of regular pitch injury exposure. Roman military surgeons had enough patients with pitch wounds to develop a separate diagnostic category for them. The existence of the category implies the existence of the caseload. The caseload implies a weapon in regular use. By the 3rd century, Byzantine military law had developed specific prohibition language around incendiary agents deployed against surrendering enemies. The category that emerged, incendiary agents producing injuries incompatible with survival or field treatment, maps with striking precision onto the distinctions in Protocol 3 of the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, enacted in 1980. The Byzantines were not anticipating that convention. They were working from the same empirical foundation. They had bodies, they knew what pitch did to a person, and they drew the line based on clinical evidence rather than legal theory. The line they drew in the 3rd century and the line the UN drew in 1980 describe the same category of harm: a pot of burning black material on a stone wall, 2,000 years before napalm. The same physics, the same injuries, the same prohibition eventually written around it. All right, number 4. Naphtha weapons. 324 BC, the Indian city of Harmatilia. Alexander the Great's army, advancing east after the Battle of the Hydaspes, encounters a resistance that baffles his experienced Macedonian vanguard. Diodorus Siculus and Quintus Curtius Rufus, both working from earlier Hellenistic sources, record what happened. A substance was deployed against the Macedonian troops that caught fire with no apparent source of ignition. The soldiers attempted to extinguish it with water. The water spread the fire. The Greek text uses the word naphtha. It is the same word we use today. Natural naphtha, raw light petroleum fraction, seeps to the surface across the Levant and Mesopotamia from subsurface hydrocarbon deposits present and accessible since before recorded history. The earliest documented uses are in waterproofing and construction adhesives, recorded in Mesopotamian cuneiform texts dating to approximately 3000 BC. The chemistry that makes weaponized naphtha effective? It evaporates at room temperature into vapors that ignite at considerably lower temperatures than the liquid itself. It adheres to porous materials including linen and leather armor. In certain concentrations, it can reach its auto-ignition threshold from friction or significant ambient heat without requiring a flame. When Alexander's men poured water on burning naphtha, the water dispersed the burning liquid across a wider surface area. The fire grew larger. The Macedonians had no response protocol. This is the first documented case in Western military literature of an army, with no prior exposure encountering an unfamiliar incendiary chemistry and having to improvise around it in real time. Diodorus records the confusion explicitly. The officers of Alexander's vanguard did not know what they were dealing with. They made the standard response, water, and watched it make things worse. Military historians classify naphtha weapons under incendiary technology rather than chemical warfare. The distinction rests on delivery method rather than mechanism of injury. But the mechanism of injury is what matters here. Naphtha's mechanism is chemical. The hydrocarbon compound reacts with tissue, penetrates porous armor, and sustains combustion through a process that standard battlefield fire suppression, sand, earth, water, fabric, cannot reliably interrupt. The injury it produces is not different in kind from a Greek fire burn. It is an earlier, less refined version of the same category. In 189 BC, Antiochus III deployed naphtha-based weapons against Roman forces in Asia Minor. Polybius's account is oblique, but the Roman response is documented. Within a generation, Roman military law had prohibition language around petroleum-based incendiaries in combat between Roman armies, the same logic that would later govern the Greek fire ban within Byzantine military codes. Plutarch's account of Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BC describes a reappearance of naphtha against Roman forces, with Antony's officers condemning it as warfare outside honorable conduct. The pattern repeats across 3 centuries. Encounter the weapon, suffer casualties, prohibit it within your own military's conduct codes. The prohibitions never stopped the weapon on the opposing side. They only established how Rome preferred its own soldiers to die. Natural petroleum at the surface at Harmatelia, at Dura, at the Dead Sea Basin, accessible since before recorded history. The only step was setting it on fire and pointing it at someone. Every civilization in the region eventually made that decision, and every civilization that made it eventually wrote a law. The naphtha trajectory from 324 BC to 672 AD is not an escalation story. It is the story of a chemistry that was understood, constrained by informal prohibition, and then perfected in secret by Byzantine engineers until Greek fire emerged. The weapon naphtha becomes when a civilization has the metallurgy to pressurize it and the statecraft to classify the formula. All right. Number 3. Aconitine, Rome. 81 BC. Lucius Cornelius Sulla passes legislation that will stand as Roman law for 5 centuries. The Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Beneficis, the Cornelian law on assassins and poisoners, makes the sale, possession, and intentional use of specific toxic substances a capital offense. The substance at the center of the law's most severe penalties is named in the text, not poisons generally. Aconitum, specifically, by genus. Aconitum napellus, monkshood, wolfsbane, is an alpine flowering plant whose roots and leaves contain aconitine at concentrations up to 0.8% of dry weight in the most potent specimen. Aconitine activates sodium channels in cardiac muscle and neurons, forcing a rapid ion influx that produces an immediate sensation of cold, spreading numbness, ventricular arrhythmia, and cardiac arrest. The lethal oral dose in humans is approximately 1 to 2 milligrams. A single gram of dried root material contains enough aconitine to kill an adult. There is no antidote. Modern intensive care, intravenous atropine, cardiac monitoring, sustained resuscitation, manages a patient through the metabolization process with a clinical fatality rate of approximately 10% under ideal conditions. In antiquity, without any of those interventions, significant aconitine exposure was effectively unsurvivable. The compound metabolizes in 6 to 8 hours. In the ancient world, those 8 hours could not be managed. Plutarch records the execution of Locusta, Rome's most documented professional poisoner, under the Emperor Galba in 69 AD. Her known toolkit included aconitum extract. She had supplied it for the assassination of the Emperor Claudius in 54 AD, and before that for Nero's elimination of Britannicus. The Lex Cornelia was not aspirational legislation. It was reactive, written in response to documented use, refined through prosecutions, specific enough in its language that Roman courts had already worked through enough cases to require a named compound rather than a general category. The compound did not stay in the hands of assassins. The conventional academic framing treats Roman poison legislation as primarily concerned with private crime, assassination, inheritance fraud, political conspiracy. The court records that survived from the imperial period support that framing, but the Arthashastra has a different frame entirely. Kautilia's Arthashastra, a 4th century BC Indian treatise on statecraft and military science, devotes substantial sections to what it calls rasavidya, applied toxicology in warfare. It describes specific methods for introducing aconite-based preparations into enemy food and water supplies, arrow preparation methods using concentrated plant alkaloids for battlefield deployment, toxic smoke produced by burning specific botanical mixtures to incapacitate troops in enclosed positions. The Arthashastra is a military manual. It is describing weapon systems and their operational parameters. Then, in the same chapters, it describes the prohibitions on use against non-combatants, on contamination of civilian waters, on deployment of specific substances during negotiations or truces. The prohibitions and the instructions occupy the same text, because Kautilya understood something the framers of the Lex Cornelia also understood. A weapon effective enough to require documentation is effective enough to require constraint. The prohibition must be written alongside the knowledge, or the knowledge outpaces any after-the-fact restriction. Rome named the plant in capital crime legislation. India wrote the weapons operating manual and its rules of engagement in the same document, in the same century, 4,000 miles apart. Both civilizations reached the same conclusion through different institutional paths. This specific chemistry required legal architecture that normal weapons did not, and the legal architecture needed to be as specific as the chemistry itself. Aconitine has been in continuous use as a poison from the 4th century BC to the present. The Lex Cornelia failed to eradicate it. The Arthashastra's prohibitions did not contain it. The plant does not require technology. It requires a garden, a root mass, and the understanding that a lethal dose measures in milligrams. That knowledge has never been restricted. It never will be. All right. Number 2. The Dura Europos gas. 1920s, Eastern Syria, on the Euphrates. A joint French-American archaeological expedition begins excavating Dura Europos, a Roman frontier garrison abandoned in the mid-3rd century. The site yields extraordinary material: Roman frescoes, a synagogue with intact murals, military equipment in sealed contexts. In 1930, the excavators find a network of tunnels beneath the western wall. The tunnels show evidence of violent collapse in one specific section. Inside, the skeletal remains of 20 Roman soldiers, found in a space approximately 2 meters wide and less than 1.5 meters in height. The bodies were stacked, not scattered, not spread across the tunnel. Stacked, the remains were catalogued. The tunnel system entered the archaeological record. For 70 years, the 20 soldiers were a documented feature of the site, photographed, described in the excavation reports, incorporated into the standard literature on the siege, without a forensic explanation for how they died or why they were found in that configuration. In 2009, Simon James, classicist and archaeologist at the University of Leicester, published a reconstruction in the American Journal of Archaeology. James examined the skeletal positioning, the tunnel architecture, the evidence of rapid sealed collapse at the tunnel entrance, and cross-referenced the site with Sassanid Persian military engineering practices documented in contemporaneous texts. His reconstruction, in 256 AD, when the Sassanid army of Shapur I besieged Dura Europos, Persian engineers began undermining the western wall from below. Roman engineers countermined to disrupt the operation, standard mine warfare practice. When the Roman soldiers entered the tunnel, the Sassanids sealed the entrance behind them and introduced a burning mixture of bitumen and sulfur crystals. The combustion in a sealed underground space of roughly 30 cubic meters produced sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide in concentrations sufficient to render the soldiers unconscious. Not in minutes, seconds. At 500 parts per million, sulfur dioxide causes rapid incapacitation. The sealed tunnel with active combustion would have reached that threshold almost immediately after ignition. The carbon monoxide produced by incomplete bitumen combustion in a low oxygen enclosed space compounded the effect. The two gases working simultaneously in a space with no ventilation and no exit produced a lethality that did not require precision chemistry. It required a sealed space, a combustible mixture, and the patience to wait. The skeletal positioning is the evidence. Bodies concentrated near the tunnel entrance. Those deeper in the tunnel, farther from the exit, fell first. Those near the entrance fell, attempting to retreat, overtaken before they could clear the sealed section. This is the gas casualty distribution pattern. Incapacitation moves from the point of of introduction toward the exit, and even those closest to the exit cannot move faster than the concentration front traveling by. James found no evidence of wounds consistent with close quarters combat, no defensive bone fractures, no blade marks. The 20 soldiers died without fighting whatever killed them, because they never saw it. For decades, the accepted interpretation of the Dura Europos tunnel deaths was tunnel collapse or close quarters underground combat, the standard archaeological explanations for mine warfare casualties. But the skeletal arrangement does not match either. Tunnel collapse produces distributed victims displaced by the force of structural failure. Close quarters combat produces wound patterns. Neither is present at Dura Europos. The Sassanid sources from this period, including the Shapur I victory inscriptions at Naksha Rostam, which documents the Dura campaign in considerable detail, do not explicitly describe the tunnel tactic. The silence is itself interesting. But the Persian engineering texts of the same period document the use of bitumen and sulfur in closed-space combustion systems for heat generation and fortification applications. James's reconstruction uses only materials and techniques contemporaneously documented in Sassanid engineering practice. Nothing in the model requires technology that did not exist in 256 AD. 20 Roman soldiers entered a tunnel to disrupt an enemy mining operation. The Sassanids had been waiting. The entrance was sealed after the Romans were inside. The burning mixture went in. The chemistry did the rest. The broader context of the 256 AD siege is important. Dura Europos was a critical garrison, the easternmost significant Roman military installation on the Euphrates frontier. Its loss to Shapur I was not incidental. It was part of a systematic Sassanid campaign to dismantle the Roman eastern border. The Persians took the city. They captured it so thoroughly that the Roman military never reoccupied it. The tunnel beneath the western wall was one of multiple parallel engineering operations. The gas attack was not the only tactic used, but it was the one that left physical evidence specific enough to reconstruct 1700 years later. The other tactics left ruins. The gas attack left 20 men in a documented position, in a documented space, in a configuration that the chemistry alone can explain. Simon James called the Dura Europos discovery the world's earliest archaeological evidence of chemical warfare. Not the earliest alleged use, not the earliest described use in a classical text, the earliest surviving physical evidence, bones in a sealed tunnel, positioned by the chemistry that killed them, preserved for 7,100 years until someone looked at the stacking pattern and asked why the bodies were arranged the way they were. The Sassanids did not invent this. The chemistry of sulfur combustion in enclosed spaces was known. What they did was apply it with engineering precision, seal the exit at the right moment, and leave the evidence intact. They were not trying to create a historical record. They were trying to win a siege. 20 men. A sealed tunnel. Seconds. All right. Number 1. Greek fire. Add. The Bosphorus. The Umayyad Caliphate's fleet approaches Constantinople. The Arab naval expansion of the previous decade had been relentless. Cyprus, Rhodes, the Aegean island chain, all had bent to Umayyad pressure. The eastern Mediterranean was changing hands. Constantinople's harbor was the next objective. The fleet was substantial. The Arab commanders had proven themselves across the full width of the Mediterranean basin. The Byzantine fleet deployed Greek fire. The Umayyad advance ended, not immediately. The siege of Constantinople lasted from 674 to 678 AD, 4 years during which the Arab fleet repeatedly engaged Byzantine naval forces and was repeatedly driven back, not by superior numbers. The Byzantine navy was smaller, not by superior seamanship, by one weapon system that Arab naval engineers could not counter, and Arab naval doctrine had no framework to address. Greek fire burns on the surface of water, in the direction it is aimed, and nothing available to a 7th century navy extinguishes it. The weapon is attributed to Kolonikos of Heliopolis, a Syrian architect who fled the Arab advance and brought his formula to Constantinople around 668 AD. The emperor recognized immediately what he had received. The formula was placed under imperial classification, with penalties described by the chronicler Theophanes as including death for unauthorized disclosure. Not disclosure to enemies, to anyone, to allied states, to other Byzantine officials without explicit clearance. The weapon was delivered through a bronze siphon, a pressurized tube mounted on the ship's prow, projecting a stream of burning liquid that ignited on contact with the seawater surface. The chronicler Leo VI, writing in the late 9th century, described describes it in the Tactica, a fire liquid and burning from the water, unstoppable by water alone, that no wet sponge or cloth could extinguish. Constantine VII, in the De Administrando Imperio, compiled around 950 AD, documents the weapon with the weight of state religion, a gift from an angel to the first Christian emperor, forbidden by divine authority to be shared with any foreigner or allied state. The theological framing was political engineering. What Constantine was actually documenting was a need-to-know classification system of a precision unusual even by Byzantine standards. The formula was compartmentalized across multiple artisan groups. Different craftsmen knew different components. No single individual outside the imperial inner circle held the complete preparation sequence. The classification architecture was designed to survive defection, capture, and enhanced interrogation. A single captured Byzantine naval engineer could not reconstruct the formula from what he knew. Two captured engineers working in collaboration still could not. The system was not designed to protect a secret. It was designed to make the secret impossible to reconstruct from fragments. The weapon's effectiveness across 3 centuries of deployment confirmed the investment was justified. In 7177 AD, the Umayyad Caliph Suleiman sent a second larger fleet against Constantinople. Some Byzantine sources estimate 1,800 ships. Though modern historians favor lower figures, Greek fire met it. The Arab fleet withdrew with catastrophic losses. In 941 AD, a Russian fleet of several hundred vessels under Igor of Kiev approached the Bosphorus. Greek fire met it. The Russian sources, including the primary chronicle, describe their sailors throwing themselves into the sea to escape the burning, preferring drowning to what the fire did to a man. 3 sieges, 3 withdrawals, the same weapon each time. The Arab naval commanders, the Rus commanders, and the Byzantine admirals all understood that Greek fire was not simply a better incendiary. It was a category change. It made certain naval engagements unwinnable from the opposing side before the first contact. The conventional view treats Greek fire as a significant but ultimately isolated Byzantine military advantage, a state secret eventually lost when the empire collapsed in 1453 and the knowledge dispersed into the historical gap. But the secret was not lost. It was destroyed on purpose. When Constantinople fell, the knowledge of Greek fire did not scatter. It concentrated in the hands of people who no longer existed as a political entity. The compartmentalization that had protected the formula for 800 years became its burial structure. There was no single custodian to defect, surrender, or sell. The knowledge that different artisans held was meaningless in isolation. The complete formula required the empire's institutional architecture to assemble. When the architecture ended, the formula ended with it, not through accident, through the design of the classification system itself, which had been built, from the beginning, to die with the empire rather than be captured by its successor. Modern chemists, historians, and weapons researchers have proposed dozens of reconstructions. Quicklime water suspension with naphtha distillate, distilled petroleum with pine resin and saltpeter, calcium phosphide generating spontaneous combustion on water contact. None of the proposals has been demonstrated to simultaneously replicate all documented properties, specifically sustained combustion on a saltwater surface while being directionally projectable under pressure at ambient temperature. The combination the sources describe has not been chemically reproduced, not because modern chemistry is insufficient, because the formula was destroyed in 1453 and has not been recovered. The Byzantine military codes of the 9th and 10th centuries, the Tactica of Leo VI, explicitly prohibited the use of Greek fire against Christian enemies. Categorical, the weapon was not to be turned inward, only outward, at the boundary of civilization. The ban was not ethical sentiment, it was strategic containment. A weapon this reliable on both sides of a conflict changes the war entirely. The Byzantines had spent 3 centuries ensuring it remained on only one side. The inward deployment prohibition was a second layer of that containment strategy. It was also an acknowledgement of something deeper. A weapon whose formula the empire had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect from external discovery was a weapon whose release into any general theater, even a friendly one, risked the kind of exposure the classification system was designed to prevent. The ban on inward deployment was the Byzantines' way of saying, this thing cannot be let loose anywhere. It can only be controlled while it is ours alone. When they could no longer hold that exclusive, when the final century of the empire made the institutional structure unsustainable, they let the formula disappear. The formula burned with the empire. That was the plan. We still do not know what Greek fire was. 1,352 years after it held Constantinople against the Umayyad fleet, the compound that changed the military balance of the early medieval Mediterranean, that 3 Byzantine emperors described as a gift from God, that defended the eastern boundary of Christian Europe for 3 sieges, and held the Bosphorus for 800 years. Its chemical identity is unknown. The reconstruction attempts produce hypotheses. None produce the fire. What connects these 10 weapons is not chemistry. Chemistry is common. What connects them is the moment of recognition, the point at which someone using a particular substance stopped, looked at what they had made, and understood it was different. Not different in degree from a sword or a siege engine, different in kind. The weapons in this list did not require proximity. They did not require physical strength or skill transferable to an honest fight. They worked at a distance, in darkness, on people who had no way to see them coming, and they worked the same way on everyone they reached: soldier, civilian, child. The chemistry did not ask for military identification. That recognition produced legislation. Prohibition, the deliberate destruction of a formula. The Amphictyons wrote a ban in 590 BC. Rome named a plant in a statute. The Byzantines burned the formula with the empire. None of it stopped the next innovation. The Amphictyonic prohibition on water poisoning was eventually broken. The Lex Cornelia was worked around. Greek fire's secret ended when the empire did, but naphtha never disappeared, and the 20th century rebuilt the weapon from first principles and pointed it at millions. The chemical weapons that killed at Ypres in 1915, at Halabia in 1988, in the Damascus suburbs in 2013, they are not departures from the ancient record. They are continuations of it. What changes is not the logic. The logic is identical. What changes is scale. An Iron Age commander could incapacitate a platoon with terracotta pots of scorpions. A 20th century industrial state could kill a generation with compounds Cautilio had described in 300 BC, and the Arthashastra's prohibition clauses had already tried to constrain. The ancient prohibitions were not failures of imagination. They were accurate diagnoses of a problem that had no solution. The problem was never the chemistry. The chemistry was always there, in the ground, in the plants, in the petroleum seeping from the earth at Harmatilia and Dura and the Dead Sea Basin. The problem was the human capacity to look at a substance designed for one purpose and understand its application as another. They looked, they understood, they used it. Then they wrote the law. The law was always too late. Something is still down there. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.